All right, welcome all. Thanks again for joining us today. We're pleased to be kicking off sort of the design phase of the Gateway Area Plan and starting to do some outreach and engagement on what this area could look like in the future. And so we're happy to have all of you join us today. My name is David Loya. I'm the Director of Community Development of the City of Arcata. I'm here with my colleague Dila Freitas, Senior Planner, and Ben Noble, who's part of our consultant team that's helping to pull together this work, as well as some of the general plan updates that we're working on. And so we're pleased to have him with us today. He's going to walk us through what form-based codes are, how they could be applied in Arcata, and what the permitting pathways could look like. And so we're excited to be doing this phase. Today's presentation is primarily to try and get information out about form-based codes and to try and answer your questions. There will be follow-up in subsequent phases where we'll be doing more community design engagement and having more of a discussion around what should be incorporated into a form-based code that could be adopted for the city of Arcata. So it's a multi-step process. You're not going to get it all in this first meeting, although I know we're all very anxious to see the results of this. It will take time for us to roll all of this engagement out and make sure that we've got full participation. So excited to kick this off. And the one thing I'll say before I turn it over to Ben is that part of the reason we're doing this on Zoom is so that we can have a recording of the meeting. Meeting is being recorded. And we'll be able to use this in a couple of different ways to reach out and engage with folks that weren't able to take their time out of their day today to attend this lunchtime meeting. Realize it's a quick turnaround on meeting time, but and also kind of an odd time to have a meeting. But the purpose is to be able to use this recording as a way to use this engagement with other people. So to that end, if you have a group that you'd like us to do a Will Come to You session with, we can bring this recording and do basically this exact same meeting with that group. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ben, and we have others on our city team and consultant team that we can bring in as needed. So thank you, Ben.
Great.
Take it away.
Thanks, David, and welcome everybody. It's great to see the number of participants that we have. I'm going to share my screen and then endeavor to begin a presentation. So can everybody see, or David or Dilo,
Yep.
Can you see the title slide? Great.
Looking great.
Excellent. So as David mentioned, my name is Ben Noble. I'm part of the consultant team working on the Gateway Area Plan. I'm a sub-consultant to Plan West Partners on this work, and I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm really delighted to be working with David and Dilo and other members of the Arcata city staff on this important project. My background is I'm an independent consultant, sole proprietor, focusing on development code updates, including form-based codes. I've been doing that independently for about 8 years, and prior to that, I was a principal at a larger firm, Placeworks, where I oversaw the zoning practice. And as David mentioned, as part of the Gateway Area Plan, there is the intention to prepare a form-based code that will regulate development in this area. And so as an initial meeting today, we want to provide some background information and an introduction to form-based codes to help inform the process as we move forward. So this presentation will be divided into 3 parts. The first part will be an introduction to form-based codes generally. The second part will be to speak more specifically to plans for the Gateway Area form-based code. And then the third part will focus on a particularly important aspect of the code, which is the permits and approval requirements. So part 1 I'm going to cover what a form-based code is and provide examples of form-based codes from other communities. Here's a working definition of what a form-based code is. Essentially, it's a land development regulation that implements a plan with physical form as its organizing principle. So a form-based code emphasizes the relationships between building facades in the public realm, form and mass of buildings in relation to one another, and the scale and types of streets and open spaces. Form-based code de-emphasizes the separation of uses, and the code contains objective standards, not guidelines or subjective requirements. And lastly, a form-based code presents these standards in both words and clearly drawn diagrams and other visuals. So I understand there's a lot to unpack on this slide, but I'm going to go through it in a little bit more detail, particularly by providing examples. One way to think about this is to compare a form-based code to more traditional zoning, similar to what you may be familiar with the city's land use code. So while traditional zoning is generally more text focused, in a form-based code, standards and requirements are presented in a more graphical focused way. Whereas traditional zoning focuses on allowed land uses and land uses that are not allowed, a form-based code is primarily focused on physical form. Whereas traditional zoning often relies on subjective requirements, say, for example, through design review criteria or findings, form-based codes are focused more and based on objective standards. The traditional zoning code often is focused on land use segregation and separation of uses within zoning districts, whereas a form-based code is more oriented towards mixed use. And then traditional zoning is typically focused on what can happen on one individual property, whether that's allowed land use or development standards, whereas a form-based code is taking a more holistic look at neighborhoods and districts and focusing on how development relates to to other development as well as to the public realm overall. And then lastly, traditional zoning tends to be more prescriptive in terms of identifying what you can't do. Say, for example, a setback. A building cannot be located closer than 15 feet from a property line, for example. Whereas a form-based code tends to be more proscriptive, where it's identifying what is desired or required. And an example of that might be a build-to line, where development is required to be located at a certain distance from the property line or within a zone adjacent to the property line. So this table is another way to help think about the differences between more traditional zoning codes and a form-based code. Another very important aspect of a form-based code is its reliance on objective standards, as I mentioned. And state law has a definition of objective standards that appears in various locations within the government code, and it's on the screen here. An objective standard involves no personal or subjective judgment by a public official, and these standards are uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criteria. And this is available and knowable by both the development applicant or proponent and the public official prior to submittal. So this is the objective standard definition that appears in state law. And as the city proceeds with the form-based code for the gateway area, ensuring that we establish objective standards for the code is going to be particularly important. So here's an example comparing a subjective requirement to an objective standard. So a subjective requirement might be something like provide for active storefronts that support pedestrian activities. You might find this kind of requirement in a design review finding, for example. An objective standard that addresses the same issue might be something like blank walls of more than 10 linear feet are prohibited along any street-facing facade. And this is a very simplified standard, I understand, but it is an example of an objective standard where there's no personal or subjective judgment involved. It's something that can be verifiable and knowable in advance by an applicant, city staff, and the public as well. Okay, so now I'm going to get into a little bit more about what the form-based code is and dive into a little bit of history, of recent history of zoning, urban design, and planning. What I have on the screen here is something of an iconic image in the world of city planning and urban design. It's an image of what's known as the urban to rural transect. And this is a concept that came out in the late 1990s by a group of architects and designers known as New Urbanists. And this group aimed to promote environmentally sustainable development with more walkable neighborhoods, with a wide range of housing and a mix of land uses. And one of the champions among the New Urbanists was an architect by the name of Andres Duany. And when Duany analyzed the state of cities and urban form in the United States at that time, he identified traditional zoning as a source of many of the problems facing urban communities in America in terms of the separation of uses, of the focus on allowed land uses rather than urban form, and ignoring aspects of the public realm and place-making objectives. So Duany thought that we need a different way of thinking about land development regulation, and that instead of a use-focused zone as an organizing principle, he proposed the urban to rural transect. And this concept envisions the built environment as a continuum of place types that transitions from the least intensive to the most intensive. And each of these place types or transect zones is defined primarily by urban form rather than allowed land use. And this urban to rural transect provided a foundation for a new type of a zoning code referred to as a form-based code. And Duany and his firm, Duany, Plater, Zeitberg, was one of the early champions of form-based codes, and his form-based code is something that is referred to as a smart code. And so you'll see smart codes around today, and they typically will establish transect zones with the numbers T1, T2, and T3. And where that comes from is the transect concept illustrated by this diagram. And then so moving forward to today, it's been about 25 years since the first smart code came out, and form-based codes have evolved, but many of the underlying principles remain the same. And this transect concept is one of them, with modern form-based codes organized around a series of place-based districts that range from the least to the most intense. So on the screen, I'm showing a graphic that's illustrating zoning districts for the recently adopted South Bend, Indiana form-based code, which is an excellent code that's helping to revitalize a mid-sized Rust Belt community in the Midwest. And so I'm going to show a number of examples from this code because I think it does a really good job of graphically illustrating what a form-based code is all about. And I think this graphic is interesting because you can see on the top sort of this less urban to more urban continuum that's reflective of the transect concept that Duany put forward 25 years ago. So most, but not all form-based codes are applied to a specific geographic area. And so as such, the code needs a map or a diagram that shows where different rules apply. And the mechanism that a form-based code uses for this is what is typically referred to as a regulating plan, which may look similar to a zoning map, but it's different from a zoning map in a number of different ways. And what I have on the screen is the regulating plan, or I should say part of the regulating plan from the Central Petaluma specific plan, which was one of the early form-based codes in California. And one of the things that's different with a regulating plan compared to a zoning map is that it's not just about districts and allowed uses, but it's also about the public realm. So a regulating plan may include location-specific standards for open space, for streets, how buildings relate to the public realm, sometimes standards as illustrated in a regulating plan are block specific with different rules for specific properties, even within the same transect or zoning or form-based code district. And so this is an important foundation for any form-based code. And a form-based code often applies within an existing urban area, but it can also be used for greenfield development as well as urban infill, and to create new neighborhoods where development previously didn't exist. So here's an example of a form-based code for that kind of a setting. It's for a plan and a code down in Southern California in Rancho Cucamonga. And this is a code for a new neighborhood on the edge of the city. And in addition to establishing districts through the regulating plan, it also establishes the layouts of streets and open spaces and how those are connected in an effort to create a complete neighborhood. Next slide, please. Okay, so now going back to the transect concept, here's a series of illustrations that shows the form and characters of districts along a continuum from the least intensive to the most intensive. These diagrams, again, are from the South Bend zoning ordinance. And on the screen now is a illustration for the urban neighborhood 1 district. And you can see characteristics of this district in terms of building width, building depths, height, frontages of the homes, the streetscape design, as well as the roadway design. And here's an illustration moving to a more intensive residential neighborhood where you can see different building types, different treatments for frontage improvements, and different site layouts with unique building typologies. And again, here is an illustration for a neighborhood serving commercial district with a very different urban form, both for the mixed use development as well as for the residential only development off of the main street, really thinking about how building form and standards for the public realm support placemaking and creating complete neighborhoods. And then lastly, here's the most intensive district in this code for the downtown setting. So for these different districts that are based primarily on form and character, a form-based code will establish objective standards as a central organizing principle. And I like to think about these standards as being organized around 6 dimensions of prescriptive standards. And these standards typically focus on how buildings relate to one another and public spaces as well as the public realm. So it starts with lot configuration and building placement, access and parking, building massing, facade designs, and other site features. So a form-based code will address all of these different aspects of urban design tailored for each individual district. So I'm going to show some images of how a form-based code might address these different dimensions of urban design. So here's a diagram again from South Bend that is showing standards for lot configuration and building placement. As I mentioned previously, form-based codes are often very graphic in terms of the way that they present standards. And this is a good example of that. So on the left, you have a diagram that's accompanied by a table on the right, and these two work together. And a couple of things that I think are notable about these lot configuration and building placement standards is that with setbacks, there's both a minimum and a maximum setback. There's a requirement for a certain percentage of the street-facing building facade to be located within a setback zone. And these standards are prescriptive rather than proscriptive. So form-based codes are often very concerned about the placement and design of parking and access to that parking because of the impact that parking and vehicle access can play on the quality of the pedestrian environment. So here's an example of standards which require parking to be located on a certain area of the property behind a street-facing building, and establishing rules for where vehicles can access that parking. Essentially, if a property is served by an alley and it's an interior lot, the parking access must be provided from that alley. So that type of standard is also common within form-based code. Okay, so building massing. This is a simple diagram that's illustrating minimum and maximum heights, as well as required upper story setbacks. Form-based codes often are very interested in objective standards for building massing, requiring variation in building heights, establishing maximum building widths, and requiring for reduced intensity, reduced heights, for example, when adjacent to lower intensity residential uses. And then here is facade design. So it's the design of the skin of the building. This standard is illustrating a minimum transparency requirement that applies to both the ground floor and the upper floor. There's facade articulation standards here, as well as corner building treatments. And then lastly, a form-based code will often include standards for other site features, whether it's mechanical equipment, trash and recycling containers, fences and walls, and other things like that that are important to achieve quality design. Okay, so many of those standards may be familiar to you if you're familiar with more conventional, traditional zoning codes. But one thing that is very unique about form-based codes and a way that it departs from traditional zoning is with standards for building types. On the screen, these are some illustration of building type standards from the Buffalo Green Code recently adopted in New York State, and it's showing two examples of building types. On the left is a townhouse, and on the right is our stacked flats. And this focus on building typologies, I think, reflects a lot of the thinking of the new urbanists and their work on smart codes and thinking about in different place types, in different types of neighborhoods, different transect zones, there are certain building typologies traditionally that defined those places. And in a lot of ways, they have been lost in cities in America as development and housing development has become more standardized. And there's a desire to bring back into communities some of these more traditional building forms that support a pedestrian-oriented environment. There's also a desire to encourage a range of housing types, not just apartments or single-family homes, but lots of different configurations for multi-unit housing to provide for greater choice and diversity of available housing. And so in a form-based code, codes will often identify specific building types. The code may identify different areas where these types are permitted, and then will establish standards that apply, that are unique to these individual building types that might apply in addition to district-based standards. Another thing that is emphasized within form-based codes is something that's often referred to as frontage types. And this comes from a focus on how buildings relate to the public realm in a way that supports a pedestrian-oriented environment. I'm really thinking about the relationship between building facades and public realms. So what form-based codes often do is they identify different frontage or what is referred to as a terrace. Another thing that's interesting in form-based codes that when it applies to areas where new streets are being traditional subdivision. So a form-based code being very focused on the design of the public realm will often contain standards for open spaces. So the code may include a regulating plan that identifies the location and the types of publicly accessible open space with standards for these different types of spaces. So that's sort of an overview of what a form-based code is, what it's trying to accomplish, and some of the typical contents. I'm going to now transition into the second part of this presentation, where I'm going to be providing some examples of form-based codes in Northern California. And I'm really looking here at smaller cities that are outside of major metropolitan regions, codes that have been around a while, where we've seen some development, understanding that these are older codes and the state of the art on form-based codes has evolved, but I think they're still interesting and instructive. So going back to the Central Petaluma Specific Plan, many of you probably know Petaluma is a city in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's about 40 miles north of San Francisco in Sonoma County. And historically, it's been a center of agriculture and agricultural related distribution and manufacturing. So within Petaluma, in the central area of the city, there's a large area of underutilized land. And the city, about 20 years ago, adopted a plan that aims to reinvigorate the central district. And as part of this plan, they adopted a smart code based on the transect zone concept. And here's some photographs of development that have occurred in Petaluma over the last 15 years. And most new development has occurred south of the river in an area known as the Theater District. Most development has been in the form of mixed-use residential with housing above ground floor commercial. One of the things in the code as a smart code is that there's an emphasis on frontage types. The code identifies certain locations where shop front, terrace, and arcade frontage types are permitted. Here's an example of a shop front frontage type with standards for these different types of private frontages. And so there are rules related to ground floor transparency, the maximum depth of recessed entries, and awning dimensions. And from my perspective, this building does a pretty good job of achieving a pedestrian-friendly ground floor presence that's active and that's inviting. And part of the reason that it accomplished that is through the standards for shop front frontage types within the form-based code. An important part of the Petaluma Smart Code is standards for civic spaces. The code identifies permitted types of civic spaces, such as parks, squares, greenways, plazas, pocket plazas, and identifies the location, the permitted location of these different types. For one sub area in the plan, there's actually a regulating plan specifically for civic space that identifies the location of required civic spaces and the type and standards that apply to them. So I think what we're looking at here is probably a pocket plaza included as part of new development. And within the code, there are standards for both the minimum and the maximum size of this plaza. And I think most importantly, standards for adjacent building frontages. I think one of the reasons why this publicly accessible open space is successful is because you have storefronts that are immediately adjacent to and open out into this public space to activate it, to create sort of a welcoming environment for people. So the Petaluma Code also regulates by building type. It identifies a range of permitted building types and the location. I think what we're seeing here is an example of a Main Street building type. And this is something that reflects the historic development in central and downtown Petaluma. And there are standards that are attached to this building type. There's a minimum and maximum building height. There's a maximum width and depth of the main body of the building. There's allowed frontage types. There are rules for parking, access and placement, as well as access to upper level residents. And I think most people in visiting downtown or central Petaluma would find this development to be successful, or at least successfully implement the vision of the central specific plan. And part of the reason for that are the prescriptive standards in the form-based code for this building type. Okay, now I'm going to move on to something that is kind of completely different and a different kind of application of the form-based code concept. In Chico, Chico within their zoning code has a traditional neighborhood development or TND zoning district. And many of you may be familiar with the TND concept. This is something, again, that came out of the New Urbanists in the 1990s. Andres Duani was a champion. And the TND concept aims to achieve a complete walkable neighborhood defined by a neighborhood center with a mix of uses, a mix of housing types, an interconnected street network, a pedestrian-friendly streetscape, and public open space. So based on that concept, the city of Chico adopted a TND code within their zoning code with TND designations that range from less to most intense, consistent with the transit concept. And this is a floating zone intended to be applied in various locations throughout the city as a framework that could be used to create new walkable, complete neighborhoods. And the way the code works is that if the TND zone is applied to a specific property, it requires the preparation of a property-specific regulating plan and circulation plan. And that plan would need to identify allowed frontage types, building types consistent with the standards that are contained within the TND chapter of the zoning code. So in Chico, the TND zone was applied to a property that is known as Marion Park. The project and the property is currently under development. And what you see on the screen is a diagram that's illustrating the different parts and components of this development project. So here's a model of the proposed development that's currently under construction. This is showing an area with multifamily housing and open space. One of the requirements of the TND zoning district is that the regulating plan must include open space integrated into development. And there's a standard that there must be one type of open space within a quarter mile of 90% of the dwelling units in the development. And the code identifies the types of open space that are allowed within the TND designation. And it's up to each individual regulating plan to come up with a configuration for the open space consistent with this requirement. So the T&D zone also identifies allowed building types. Here is a rendering of one of the mixed-use buildings within the Miriam Park project. I think this probably is classified as a large mixed-use building within their system. And for this type of building, as with other building types, there are standards for building placement, minimum and maximum height, parking location, and frontage types. So the T&D zone allows for and calls for a range of housing types, including row houses or row homes. Standards attached to this building type include build-to line, minimum maximum building height, ground floor elevation, and parking placement. So here's a photograph of housing that is constructed. The other images were graphics and renderings of planned development, but this is a courtyard apartment building that has been constructed. And with this housing type, within the T&D code, there are standards related to central courtyard dimensions and parking location. I think one of the things that's interesting about Miriam Park is that through using the T&D code, they've succeeded in introducing a broad range of housing types, not just multifamily apartments or single family homes, but a real range of housing types that increase choice and I think contribute to an interesting, diverse urban environment. So a couple more examples of Northern California form-based codes. Here's an example in Grass Valley in the foothills of the Sierras. Their zoning code establishes traditional community development zones that apply to specific areas in the city. There's a town core, a neighborhood center, and a neighborhood general zones. And attached to these zones are prescriptive standards, such as a build-to line, whereas in the traditional zoning districts, there's a minimum setback. In the traditional community development zones, there's a build-to line requirement. There's minimum building frontage requirements, standards for street-facing building entrances, and other similar prescriptive form-based standards. And my last example of a California form-based code from a smaller community is in Benicia. This is a code I'm quite familiar with. I do a lot of work in Benicia, and they have a form-based code that applies to their downtown Main Street and surrounding neighborhoods. And this is a historic district. Benicia is a very historic city. Many of you probably know it's actually the location of the first capital for the state of California before it was moved to Sacramento. And for the district that applies to their main street, First Street, there are standards for build-to lines. There's a percentage of the building that must be built to the build-to line along the primary street frontage. There's minimum maximum height standards. There's a first floor ceiling height. There's parking location standards and allowed frontage types with standards. I think the building that you're seeing here has a frontage that opens out onto open space to the right. You can't really see that there. And I think that's incorporating what would be referred to as a gallery frontage type, in keeping with the sort of historic character of development in downtown Benicia and the building typologies that one finds there. Okay, so that is an overview of what a form-based code is and examples of form-based codes from California. And I hope that was informative and useful for you so that you're coming at this sharing our perspective on what a form-based code is and how it's been used in other cities. And I think that's going to help us as we move forward when thinking about what the form-based code for the Gate area can and should be. So in this part of the presentation, I'm going to move into why we're preparing a form-based code for the Gateway area and not more traditional zoning or some other approach. We're going to lay out some guiding principles that are based on community feedback so far. And then we're going to describe, or I'm going to describe the anticipated contents of the Gateway Form-Based Code. So here's a summary of why we're proceeding with form-based code for the Gateway area. And I think this reflects some of the things that I said previously when describing a form-based code. Is we think that the form-based code really is the best tool to implement the vision of the Gateway Plan and to produce a high quality housing that's desired for the community. We think it's a better tool than a more traditional zoning regulations. And a form-based code, we think will be more usable with graphics that are easy to understand and to use. We think it will work well to help make a place in our placemaking efforts. Because a form-based code is prescriptive, saying what we want rather than what we don't want, it helps to create a desired place, unlike more conventional zoning codes. There's an emphasis on creating a quality public realm where private development is integrated with the public realm. It's more predictable. Form-based code can deliver predictability for both the developer and for the community. This can save time and money for all involved in the development process and help attract investment into the community. And then land use flexibility. We're primarily interested in form, urban form, and creating public spaces. This creates flexibility so that the use of the building can adapt, can evolve over time with changing conditions. So another very important thing to think about in terms of why a form-based code is state housing law and recent changes to state housing law. Recent legislation limits the city's ability to deny multi-unit housing projects. Laws also require cities to rely on objective standards when approving or denying housing projects, and in some cases require by right approvals for qualifying projects. So there's the Housing Accountability Act, there's the Housing Crisis Act, there's SB 35, and there's some pending legislation. So in terms of the Housing Accountability Act, this law has been around for a while, but it was recently updated and strengthened by the legislature. And essentially what that says is that the city cannot deny a multi-unit housing project or reduce its density if the project is consistent with objective standards, unless the city finds that the project will result in a specific adverse public health and safety impact. The Housing Crisis Act amended the Housing Accountability Act and, among other things, prohibits cities from adopting new subjective requirements for housing projects. SB 35, many of you may be familiar with this. What that does is require cities to allow a streamlined ministerial process for qualifying multifamily and mixed-use residential development that incorporates a certain percentage of affordable housing. And every year in the legislature, we see new legislation that aims to streamline residential development and allow more development by right. And one of those that's making its way through the legislature this year is AB 2011, which would require cities to allow by right residential development in certain locations in districts that are zoned for commercial and industrial uses. So housing production is an emphasis of the Gateway Area Plan, and I think a priority of the city as well to facilitate additional housing production, particularly an increased diversity of housing types that's more affordable and attainable to all income levels. And we see the form-based code as a appropriate vehicle to help achieve that objective. Part of the way that a form-based code does that is it increases certainty in terms of what is allowed and what is required And that in itself attracts investment. So if I'm a property owner thinking about maybe developing my property with multifamily housing, if I have certainty about what is required of me and what is allowed, I'm much more likely to go down that path of developing that multifamily housing. And where if I don't have that certainty, I may think twice about moving forward. Another thing about form-based codes is that they typically do not include density standards. So a density standard is often a number of dwelling units per acre. You might have 20 dwelling units per acre maximum, 30 dwelling units per acre. A form-based code instead is concerned about the size of the building envelope. And that building envelope can be divided into how many ever units a applicant, property owner, developer chooses. So that incentivizes smaller units that are therefore more affordable by design. We also think that a form-based code, because of its emphasis on creating a quality public realm, will help to create desirable neighborhoods that will attract investment and additional development. And then lastly, the predictability of a form-based code will help to sustain community support. So having at the front end an agreement on what the important standards are for quality development will help sustain the plan in the long. Okay, so now some guiding principles, and this is based very much on things that we've heard through the public outreach up to this point, both for the Gateway area as well as other planning initiatives within the community. And we really want this code to support an equitable and inclusive community. It's imperative that the code reflects Arcata's unique visual character and allows for diversity in building forms and creativity in project design. The code must require development to support a pedestrian-friendly public realm and to allow for a car-free lifestyle consistent with the city's climate action goals. So as we proceed with work on the Gateway plan and the form-based code, these principles will guide us as we move forward. So I'm now going to move into the anticipated form-based code contents. And this is our current plan based on our thinking to date. We understand that some of this may change as we proceed with this work and obtain public input and continue to work on the document. And a lot of this content will be similar to examples that I provided previously in the presentation. I'm going to go through a few of these things. So the form-based code will include a regulating plan. And in the Gateway plan, you may be familiar with a land use designation map that identifies 4 districts: the Gateway Barrel, the Gateway Hub, the Gateway Corridor, and the Gateway Neighborhood. So we anticipate that the form-based code will have form and character districts that correspond with these land use designations in the plan, with development and design standards that are unique and tailored to each of these districts. Within those district standards, we will have form and character standards addressing the important dimensions of urban design that I mentioned previously. And so part of that is going to be building placement. Where on the lots do buildings need to be located? In higher intensity districts, we anticipate that buildings will be located closer to the front property line. In the lower intensity districts that are adjacent to existing single family homes, we anticipate more of a setback with landscaping between the building and the street. So building massing is going to be a critical part of the form-based code for the Gateway area. We're anticipating minimum and maximum building height standards, minimum and maximum building width standards, and I think most importantly, standards to break up the massing of larger buildings into smaller volumes, standards that require variation of building heights, and standards that provide for sensitive transitions to adjacent lower intensity residential uses. Exterior design for this form-based code, I think, will be important as well. Standards for windows and doors, building entrances, articulation, roof forms. We're going to be looking closely at existing development in Arcata and seeking public input on aspects of building design that are important to address in the form-based code. So the form-based code will address allowed land uses, but this is going to be a dramatic departure, we anticipate, from the land use code that, as many of you know, includes an exhaustive, detailed list of allowed uses and permits that are required for all of those different uses. We want to move away from that. We want to accommodate a wide range of residential, commercial, and employment uses in order to support a more fine-grained mix of land uses. And we want to allow for the land use mix in the gateway area to evolve over time and respond to changing conditions. So we also anticipate that the form-based code will include area-wide standards that are not necessarily district-specific. Some of the important issues within the gateway area is historic resources and protecting historic resources, protecting environmental resources, promoting arts and entertainment, and addressing mobility and parking in the gateway. So we anticipate many of these standards for subjects such as these will be area-wide and not necessarily tailored to individual districts. The code will also include streetscape standards. So within the plan, there are roadway design concepts. We anticipate translating these concepts into public improvement standards within the code that will be unique to street types and may even be block specific depending on the conditions. So the gateway plan also includes an open space concept plan within the plan. We'll translate that into public open space requirements with standards for these open spaces that are established within the code. So one thing in the gateway code, form-based code, that's maybe different from some of the other examples of form-based codes is the importance of a concept sometimes referred to as community benefits. And the idea of community benefits is that a city establishes baseline standards for intensity. Let's say if you're regulating intensity by height, let's say your baseline is 3 stories. An applicant can choose to provide defined community amenities in exchange for increased allowed intensity. So for example, if an applicant goes beyond minimum requirements and provides some additional community benefits, the project could go to 5 stories or 6 stories, depending on the nature of these benefits. And this concept is sometimes referred to as incentive zoning. It's sometimes referred to as value capture as well. And it's called value capture because what cities do is they say, okay, applicant, you can build a more profitable project because of this additional intensity, but we're going to take some of that value and transform it into a public benefit. It's a common tool that many communities in California are incorporating. I've worked on a number of them. One of the ways that we envisioning it working in the gateway area is that for projects that provide community benefits, there would be by right approvals and additional height in exchange for these benefits. An applicant may select from a menu of options to provide these benefits, and that the increased development potential that would be provided as an incentive would be calibrated to the value of the benefit provided. Okay, so Another part of the form-based code would be permit requirements. And that takes us to the third and final part of this presentation. And it has its own part in this presentation because it's particularly important. It's particularly important part of the code, and it's also particularly important for our decision-making on how to proceed with the code. The permit requirements will influence the contents of the form-based code and our general approach that the code takes to regulating development in the gateway. So we're very interested in public thoughts on this subject. We're also interested in obtaining planning commission and city council thoughts on the subject when we reach that point. But we wanted to talk to you today a little bit about our thinking on this. So I'm going to speak first about state law considerations. I'm going to describe our recommended ministerial process and then go through a couple of different options for how this process could work. So as I mentioned previously, state law Housing Accountability Act, it's been around for a while, but it was recently strengthened. And for a long time, cities in California were pretty much ignoring this law. Most people didn't even know that it existed. Nobody was enforcing it. But as the housing situation in California got more problematic in terms of cost and affordability, the legislature strengthened the law and added new enforcement mechanisms. So what the Housing Accountability Act does, as I mentioned previously, is that it says cities must approve multifamily and mixed-use residential projects that are consistent with objective standards unless the project would have a specific adverse impact on the public health or safety. And cities may not deny a project or reduce the proposed density on the basis that the project conflicts with a subjective requirement. So essentially, if a project comes forward and this project is consistent with all objective standards, whether those standards are within the zoning code or the general plan or a specific plan or design standards document, if the project is consistent, the city cannot deny it and cannot reduce the density unless it makes this finding a written finding based on the preponderance of evidence, which is a high bar to hurdle. As I mentioned previously, state agencies, housing, community and development, as well as the state attorney general's office is actively enforcing on this law. And it's really interesting to me to see how within just a couple of years, particularly in the Bay Area, there's been such a focus and emphasis on what the HAA requires with an acknowledgement, recognition that cities must comply. And it's a law that is actively enforced not only by state agencies, but by community organizations that are participating in the planning and the entitlement process. So given that that is the framework that cities have to operate in terms of state law, our recommendation is that the city only use objective standards to approve or deny a proposed multifamily or mixed-use residential project within the gateway area. And when making this decision, the city would not consider project compliance with subjective requirements such as design review findings. But the city can consider subjective requirements to make non-binding recommendations to an applicant. And this may seem radical and this may seem extreme, but it's actually more or less what state law is already requiring Arcata and other cities to do. So remember, HAA requires cities to approve a project if it's consistent with objective standards unless this very difficult finding can be made. It does not allow the city to deny a project based on subjective requirements. So this ministerial process, in many ways, is very consistent with what is already required by state law. So with this ministerial process, there are a number of different options for how the process can occur. I'm going to describe three general approaches. The first being over the counter, the second being zoning administrator decision at a public meeting, and the third being planning commission decision at a public meeting. So with option one, you might think of this as an over the counter process. So planning staff would review the proposed project and would approve a zoning certificate for the project if it's consistent with objective standards. There would be a public notice, but it would be a notice of pending decision. So neighbors and the public could come to the planning department, look at the plans, and provide comments on the project, but there would be no public hearing. When staff makes a decision, either to approve the project because it's consistent with standards or to deny it because it's inconsistent, there would be the opportunity for an interested party to appeal to the planning commission, but the subject of that appeal would be limited to the determination of project conformance with objective standards. And so here's a diagram that's sort of summarizing what that process might look like. An applicant would submit the project. City staff would review the project for compliance with submittal requirements as well as objective standards. There would be a checklist of what those standards are so that both the applicant, the city, and the public can know in advance what the project needs to comply with. There would be a public notice of a pending decision, and then the zoning administrator would make the decision subject to appeal. Once the appeal period ends, the applicants could submit a building permit for the project. So there are form-based codes that incorporate a sort of ministerial over-the-counter approval. I think one of the best known ones is the code for the Central Hercules Plan, which has been around a while. That was one of the sort of early form-based codes in California. And so with this plan, for projects that are an allowed use and are consistent with standards, the department staff would approve the application within 10 working days. Another example of a form-based code with over-the-counter approvals in the city of Ventura. Ventura is a city that has enthusiastically embraced form-based codes, and they have form-based codes for a lot of different areas in the city. And all of these codes include a provision where there are defined building types subject to specific standards. And if the code, and if an applicant proposes a building type consistent with those standards, it's exempt from what they call planning permit and can be approved by right through a ministerial, essentially over-the-counter action. Okay, so the next option for how a ministerial process can work, there could be more of a public process with the zoning administrator holding a meeting. So again, the zoning administrator would focus his or her review on project conformance with the objective standards, but would make this determination at a noticed public meeting. And so at this meeting, residents would have the opportunity to provide comment on the project, but action on the project would be limited to whether or not the project conforms to objective standards. It would be the sole basis to approve or deny the application. So this would need to be made very clear to the public that when acting on the project, the city can only consider conformance to objective standards when making a decision on the project. And like with option one, the zoning administrator decision could be appealed to the planning commission. So the third option for the ministerial process is similar to option 2, but with the planning commission being the decision maker on whether or not the project conforms to the objective standard. So like with option 2, there'd be a notice, public notice of a planning commission meeting and pending decision. Residents would have the opportunity to provide comment at this meeting, but again, project conformance with objective standards would be the sole basis to approve or deny the application, with the planning commission decision being appealable to the city council. And so there are cities who do something like option 3 that I'm aware of in the context of SB 35 application. So as I mentioned previously, SB 35 is a state law where an applicant can request a streamlined ministerial approval of the project if it incorporates affordability requirement, if it is consistent with all objective standards, and meets other eligibility requirements. And so what some cities do is that they provide for a public forum for the consideration of whether or not the SB 35 application is, 1, an eligible project, and 2, is consistent with all objective standards. And it allows for increased transparency. It allows for increased public awareness that the development is occurring, and it allows for a public assessment of project conformance with an objective standards. And I'm aware of one such process in Benicia where I do a lot of work, and actually tomorrow night, there is one such meeting of a SB 35 oversight committee for an SB 35 application. So this kind of process is something that we do see, but more within the context of SB 35 applications. So a couple of final thoughts on the advantages of a ministerial process. I understand that there have been community questions about the ministerial process. I think reasonable concerns about the city losing the opportunity to evaluate, to exercise discretion on development projects on a case-by-case basis. Our assessment of this is that the ministerial process is preferable because it reflects better what the city can and can't do under the Housing Accountability Act. And we're concerned that continuing with the existing design review process for the Gateway area will generate frustration for neighbors who would be asking the city to exercise discretion that it actually does not have. And we think that it's preferable to work with the public at the front end to establish objective standards and to approve project ministerially, and to approve projects ministerially upon finding that they conform with these standards. So we're really interested in sort of having the community conversation about the permitting process and the ministerial option, and your input on that subject, as well as everything that I presented tonight and the additional outreach work that we'll be doing is needed. It's necessary and it's appreciated. And there's going to be a number of opportunities to participate, including an upcoming City Council Planning Commission joint study session, community workshops, and a range of different online engagement opportunities to make it easier for everybody to participate in the process. So with that, I will end my presentation. I really look forward to hearing your questions. I will hand it back over to David.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was great. And I hope the community enjoyed it as much as I did. We do want to go ahead and open this up to questions at this point. So you can go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. We have about 20 minutes to address questions at this point. And we did solicit questions in advance. So I'll read off the couple of questions here, and we'll have folks who feel best prepared to answer them. And we'll also take the opportunity to add to each of our comments as we need to. So the first question we received was, will there be opportunities for the community to participate developing the form-based code, and what will those opportunities look like? And I'll just kick it off by saying absolutely yes. We've described this process from the beginning as a community design process. And Ben just went over some of the sort of high level opportunities that will be there, but we'll use a range of different tools to share with the community thoughts and ideas around what types of development options there might be, how we set those standards, and how we develop that form-based code for folks to participate. There was a follow-up question to that is, will the revisions to the code be based on community participation and input, and how will the revisions be presented to the public? And the answer to that is absolutely. The process works in a way that allows the decision makers to review the comments that individuals are making before they make their decisions. And those comments that are being made, the input that we've received, will be presented to the decision makers before they make their decisions. And then there was a final follow-up question to that, and I'd like to open it to the rest of our team here to add to any of these three questions. That Red, I understand there can be form-based codes with exclusive ministerial review and also form-based code with full or some discretionary review. Can you explain how this would work? So part of Ben's presentation was tied to some of the reasons why we're suggesting a ministerial review process. And those could happen at those different tiers, over the counter, a zoning administrator hearing or a planning commission hearing, in structured such that the larger the project, the more, the higher level of scrutiny the options would be with, greater level of public participation. Certainly there can be discretionary review, and I think that the answer to this part of the question is somewhat lengthy, so I want to move on to other questions that have been raised. But I will say before I leave this that we will update our frequently asked questions to address this in more detail around what that process would look like. But in a sense, or in the highest level, what it would look like is a planning commission hearing where those projects would be reviewed by the planning commission, appealable to the city council, and the the community amenities, instead of being optional, would only be tied to conditions of approval. We'd no longer have the structure that is proposed in the plan. And I would offer that some of the community amenities wouldn't be allowable under standard conditions of approval. We'll explain that in the frequently asked questions. Anything to add to that from folks on our team around either the discretionary review process or the upcoming engagement on form-based code?
Well, for the engagement, I would just add that, some of those buckets that Ben referred to, features like streetscape, parking, building massing, open space, facade design, those are the things we're going to be polling the public on. We do have a sense, as Ben went over some of the guiding principles, we have a sense for the things that people are wanting to dig into, and we'll do our best to try and hit all those things and incorporate them into the final document.
Yeah, good point. Okay, the next set of questions that we received beforehand, let's see. This one says, questions for Ben Noble. What are the names of 2 cities that you, as Ben Noble Consulting, have done form-based codes for? And I believe this is intended to read, which of these would work best for, or best form-based code examples that would work for the city of Arcata?
So there's 2 parts to that question. The first part, example code. So I did a form-based code for the city of Merced, citywide sort of hybrid code with both form-based and traditional code components. More recently completed a form-based code for a new mixed-use district within a specific geographic area in the city of Benicia. called it the Eastern Gateway Study. I'm very happy with how that turned out. All of that can be available online. For the city of Capitola, a lot of recent work on objective standards for residential and multifamily development. I wrote the zoning code for Capitola and standards for the mixed use districts, and village district is based on form-based principles. So I think those are some that I would suggest. And in terms of the second part of the question, each place is so unique, and I think the way that we would not take a form-based code prepared for another community and try to superimpose it on the gateway area. The gateway area is such a special and unique area that it really needs to have a tailored approach.
Thanks, Ben. The next question is about how much time, days, weeks, or months have you been in Arcata? And in your opinion, is that an appropriate amount of time to create a good form-based code for us? And before I turn it over to you for discussion, I do just want to let the community know that while form-based codes are have been around for decades at this point, they are relatively new to our region, to our area, and we don't have local consultants who prepare form-based codes. So part of the process we went through for procurement for a consulting team required that they bring someone on who had knowledge and experience preparing form-based codes. And so I think part of this question speaks to, really how involved in the city of Arcata are you? Second piece to that I want to point out is that all of us are very familiar with the city of Arcata, the staff that are working in this on this project, our primary consultant. We've brought on a local architect. We're also engaging with the community. You're all very informed about Arcata. All of the decision makers are very knowledgeable about Arcata. And so the filter that recommendations that the consulting team is making is going through all of our collective local experience. But Ben, I don't know if you want to address how familiar you are with Arcata.
So to answer the question, I was in Arcata actually last Thursday and Friday. Very much enjoyed my visit. And that was the first time that I had been to Arcata since the pandemic. I had been to Arcata before the pandemic a couple of times. And I've also done a fair amount of work for Eureka. So I visited Eureka a number of times over the last 4 or 5 years as well. I'm also working on a number of other projects for the city of Arcata, including the LCP update. So I'm involved in city matters in that context as well. But I think as David mentioned, that I am part of a team. I'm not local, but I bring sort of an outside perspective and an experience in form-based code that enables me to work successfully with local partners. So I think it's working well.
Great. The next question I'll just address briefly. It says, how far along are you in developing the form-based code for the Arcata Gateway plan? Are you just getting started, or roughly 20% done, or about halfway done, or maybe 3/4? There are a couple folks that have their hands raised, so I want to get through these fairly quickly. And I'll just say that no, we have not started the form-based code at this point. This is the initial work to begin the engagement, and I've described at several different meetings the reasons why we haven't started this earlier. So we'll move on from there. It says you've done at least some of the form-based code for the Gateway plan, correct? The Planning Commission and the public have been waiting for months to see any sample of it. Exactly when can we see a chapter? And I think that's just a follow-up on the last question, which we've already addressed. So I'm going to go ahead and open it. Those are the written questions that we received in advance. And I'm just going to allow you to talk and then ask you to go ahead and ask your question, and we'll try and address it. So Chris, you're first up.
Okay, thank you. I had a question for Ben. I was just curious, how other cities have dealt with, I mean, how common or typical is that you'll have an area zone that uses the form-based codes for the development, but also run parallel options for traditional zoning for projects that don't match the form-based code? Is that something common that happens in cities that are using these form-based codes in their specific areas?
Thanks,
I
Chris.
would not that I'm familiar with. I've seen examples, like the Grass Valley example, where you have a form-based code for certain geographic areas, and then for other areas, say established suburban neighborhoods, you have a different code. But you don't see two sort of options for one specific area. There is the development standards, and there's really one set of rules that applies to you. In fact, I think under state law, if you have different options, that would raise all sorts of complications and maybe isn't even a feasible way to do it.
I think Ben, that the question was tied to the way that we have the standard tier that goes through a planning process if you're not building out to community tier 1 at the very least. Just to address that, from the concept behind that was in part to recognize that this area has an eclectic mix of different uses, and applying a form that would require, for example, a single family home that wanted to do an addition to comply then with that form without having another process, or to require a development that was intending to provide, say, 100 jobs to the area, that wasn't intending to build any housing, to not be able to be built as a result of that. We wanted to have some safety valves in our code, so that all of these different project types that aren't necessarily going to be able to comply with the form still have a pathway. So that was the rationale.
I'm sorry,
there.
I didn't understand the question.
Okay, James, you're up next.
Hi, this is James Becker, and my question is also for Ben Noble, and I do want to thank him for the time he's spending in this process. And hi, Ben. My question is related to, I specifically live in the Gateway area, and we're in the Devlin Cottages, and there's 4 of them on 7th Street. It's considered to be a part of the corridor and right next to the Barrow District. A number of potential developments on a few sides. And the thing that I was most curious about is form-based codes in relation to siting and setbacks, and in terms of solar shadowing. And I realize that that's something that is definitely can be addressed through form-based codes, and just wondering with that real, situation there, if there's something that you might give me as far as ideas. It's a historic neighborhood, so it kind of represents an area that may or may not be addressed as that. And just as far as, potential, looking at all these other areas, within those, of course, we're looking at 3- and 4-story buildings, and everything was kind of appropriately height and sited. So, but it's more specifically how form-based codes might address setbacks, step backs, and solar shadowing. And that's it. I hope that wasn't too long-winded.
Right, yes.
That was great, Jim.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Jim, for the question. Yes, definitely. I think that's a high priority for us to think about how the standards address relationships with existing historic properties and impacts on those properties. And so we'll be looking at a number of different tools to address solar impacts, things like reduced heights, step downs, and also thinking about the character of buildings and how that relates to historic properties in terms of frontage types and other design treatments.
Great, thanks. Jane, go ahead.
Hi, Jane Woodward. This is a great presentation. I wish we'd had it 5 months ago. If we had, we might have dealt with a lot of the questions and issues we've had. It I have a couple of different questions. One, you didn't actually answer when we would see a draft, and associated with that, how are you going to provide that? Are you going to provide like pieces like streetscapes, like massing, one time? Are we going to get it all at once, or are we going to get it in segments associated with the various issues? That's my first question. I'll wait for my second one. I'll wait for an answer until I get before I give the second question, if that's okay. Can anybody answer that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the intent here is to do some initial work with the community to get input so that we have a target that we're aiming for. Then we would bring back a draft of the plan to then refine through additional public engagement. Because of the some of the issues that have come up around potential pathways for approval and the timelines for developing some of these documents, you'll see the general plan come out first. The environmental document will then be based on the project description that the general plan is trying to implement. The environmental document will be certified, and then we can start proving pieces of it. There may be elements of the general plan that identify new codes that need to be developed, or implementation measures that need to be developed to implement the general plan. And one of those implementation programs will be to complete the form-based code. So we're running a little bit concurrently, but the form-based code will come after those general plan updates.
Okay, let me try to get this a little more concrete. In other words, are we going to sit down and have a discussion on the specifics, like how tall buildings, how massive, building types, setbacks, the percentage of the property that's utilized, placement? Can we have a process to go through those issues with the public, like we've been going through elements of the land use plan? Okay, because that would then allow us to have concrete discussions. Okay, how many people want building heights, over 4 stories?
Yeah.
I'm wanting to get us into the specifics and how you're going to engage the public with that.
Yeah, yes, the public will have access to all of that, and the decision makers will too before they make decisions. So I know you have a lot of questions, Jane.
I'm just trying to figure out when.
Yeah,
Okay.
over the course of the next couple of months, we're starting the process. Today is the first day that we're starting to talk about form-based code. We've still got some decisions to make, and it's going to take some time for us to go through that process, and we'll continue to outline what those, when those deliverables are coming out and when we can start sharing them with the public. So stay tuned. I'm going to
Okay, I think this has been excellent. And my second question is, okay.
Okay, Jane, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Jane. I'll come back to you if we have time. We have several other members who are asking to ask a question. Oh. Go ahead, Moonlight.
Yes, thank you very much. Ben, I really enjoyed the well-paced presentation and the visuals provided in the PowerPoint. And I appreciate that this has been recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel. David, since we're all in our own buckets here, I was just curious how many community members, minus the staff and consultant team, were able to log on tonight for this Zoom meeting. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Moonlight.
30.
That's a great
Sorry,
Oh,
David.
go ahead, Dale.
I logged 30 at most. We have 25 attendees at the moment.
Yeah, and to answer to the people who aren't part of the city team, we had 18. We had a couple people come in late and then one person drop off. So I'm counting a total of 20 public members.
That's great. I really appreciate that information. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Okay. And I'll also say that, again, I mentioned at the beginning, but I want to just reiterate that, we're going to hopefully use this video in a couple of different ways to, to message this information out to the community and continue to be able to answer your questions about it. So you have immediate questions now, you may have new questions later. We'll have additional opportunities for those questions. Oh, okay. Okay, Joan, I am trying to let you in. You're on an older platform of Zoom, and the only way you can ask your question is if you join the panelists. So click that button when it comes up. Okay, perfect, you're in. Okay, Joan, hang tight. I'm gonna go on to Brandon, and you'll be in the wings, okay? Go ahead, Brandon.
Hey, great presentation. And I had a quick kind of technical question on the Senate Bill 35. I think that's great incentive to provide more housing, but I was wondering how that applies to mixed use development. So like, commercial, ground floor, residential above. Does that same design review waiver, does the same permit process apply to mixed use development or just solely residential? And if so, then how do you incentivize mixed use development as well?
So a mixed use development is eligible for SB 35 if 2/3 of its floor area is residential.
Okay, Joan is still connecting. So Jane, I'm gonna come back to you. Go ahead. Jane, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, thank you. My question is, or it's really more observation based on the issues here and the state legislation. It appears that we are very unprotected if we do not develop objective standards. So it sounds like the key to protecting our the character of the city is to develop very excellent design standard, objective standards on mass and height and things like that, that will maintain the character of the city while increasing residential development. And the key to all that is getting people's information on explicit, exact issues. In other words, building height, mass, distance, facades, things like that. So we need to try to find a way to survey the public and gather information of what they want. So that's it. Thank you. This is great.
You hit the nail on the head, Jane. Thank you for that. Okay, Joan, it looks like you're not able to connect to audio. I'm so sorry for that. We are going to wrap up. I would say stay tuned for additional opportunities to continue this conversation. This is kind of phase one of this part of the engagement. Phase two will involve a lot more design, and we'll be able to start digging into some of those details that many of you are so interested in digging into. So again, thank you all for your time today. Ben, thank you so much for the great presentation. Dilo, thank you for pulling it all together. And we will see you next time.